everybody, and welcome to the LSU Sports Insider podcast for Wednesday, March the 12th. I'm Zach Ewing with LSU Baseball beat writer at The Advocate. He's Koki Riley. Got a special guest today. He is Joe Healy of D1Baseball. We are going to preview a little SEC baseball season, Koki.
Yeah, it's finally time. It's finally here, after so many losses.
Man, it's like the season barely started.
Well, it feels like, once you, especially after the Frisco week, it was like, can we just get the conference play and get to all the very exciting games that are about to happen? Because that Frisco week was like a nice little preview of what was to come. So like last weekend, we were just like, let's get through this, even though you had a good feeling that they were going to win those games pretty easily, and they did for the most part. So, now we're on to conference play, and finally the show begins.
I get that. So this is going to be a full SEC show. After we talk with Joe, he's been kind enough to give us 30 to 40 minutes. We'll see how things go. And then we're going to have TJ Brown, our men's basketball beat writer, on. He's going to preview the SEC men's basketball tournament, which has already begun, I think, in Nashville. We're actually filming this on Tuesday. By the time y'all listen to it on Wednesday, it will have begun. LSU, of course, has had a miserable season in basketball, but that's the beauty of college basketball. As it is in college baseball, you just never know if somebody catches fire at the right time. So we'll talk to TJ about that and get his predictions. So an all SEC show. Encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We had a spring football preview on Monday's podcast. You can find that, as well as some live reaction videos. We did one when LSU hired its new defensive line coach, Kyle Williams, last week, and that sort of stuff that you can't find on the regular podcast feed. So head on over to YouTube. And while you're down there, hit the like button for us. So without further ado, let's bring on Mr. Joe Healy of D1Baseball. Here he is. And Joe, we appreciate you joining us. First of all, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure you're like the rest of us. SEC baseball season opening day, it's like a holiday.
No, that's right. And thank you for having me, first off. And I'm actually a little bit with Koki here, where I don't know what it is about this season, but the non-conference slate seemed like it went on for years. And I think part of it has to do with my colleague at D1Baseball, Mark Etheridge, did the number crunching on this. And in non-conference play, the SEC had more wins by 10 or more, 70, than losses, which was 35. Wow. So twice as many wins by 10 or more runs than losses. And frankly, and I don't mean to dump on LSU's first conference opponent, but 8 of those losses are Missouri. So like you're talking 27 losses from everyone else, which is even more impressive. So anyway, I'm with Koki, where it's like, my goodness, can we just please get to conference play? And it's here, so I'm excited.
And 6 of those losses, Joe, are preseason number 1 Texas A&M. So
as hard as that is to believe.
We'll talk about some SEC storylines as we go. We kind of wanted to start with LSU, and then we'll circle back to them at the end of the conversation. Obviously, you all at D1Baseball have the Tigers ranked number 1, and it's not without good reason. Look, they're 15-1, and they've played tremendously well at times, beaten some good teams up there in Texas. They also haven't played the world's toughest schedule. So give me your kind of Cliff's notes of what the national perception is of LSU and why you all have them at number 1.
Well, unfortunately, I feel like some of the national perception has been colored by the fact that everyone else has Tennessee number 1. And therefore, it's kind of like, I think there's been a little bit of looking askance at us having LSU number 1 and kind of like trying to poke holes in LSU, right? So I do think maybe the national narrative has maybe been a little unfairly negative towards LSU because everyone sees it as Tennessee being the best team, and they might be. I might believe that. But look, we had LSU ahead of Tennessee in the preseason, and 1 loss to Omaha, because let's be honest, that's what it comes down to. 1 loss to Omaha is not enough for us to decide, you know what, we were wrong. We're going to put Tennessee ahead of LSU, because to your point, and Tennessee's the same way. Okay, each team has played 1 tough weekend. Is that enough to change our minds about what we thought about these teams preseason? No. Once we get into SEC play, now we can have a different conversation. But 1 loss to Omaha is not going to change the narrative for us. Now, in terms of on the field, Koki and I talked about this last week. Like, I've just been so impressed by the depth that's been created by the young players, because I think we kind of knew a lot of what who they were banking on from a veteran standpoint, whether it's guys who are coming back or guys who they brought in via transfer. But the fact that these freshmen are so good so quickly has really given them a lot of depth that I think was a little bit unanticipated by at least those outside the baseball offices. And so when I'm on radio or other podcasts or whatever, like that's the thing I get asked about most with LSU is like, how about these young players? Like, did you expect this? How much did you expect this? All of that kind of stuff, because it has been really impressive.
Is there a part of you still that says, okay, they've done it against Omaha and North Alabama and Southern, but and even Missouri this weekend, as you said, like as a Missouri grad, I'm not going to smash them too much, but like it's not going to be the same as it is the next 9 weekends.
Yeah, I think there is some of that, and yeah, and it's funny on our podcast, Howie to Hoover, we go out of our way to try to deal with Missouri on Missouri's terms instead of being two more people that just kind of like act like Missouri is this appendage to the rest of the SEC baseball. So like I get, anyway, moral of the story. But yeah, I mean, but I think you could say the same about pretty much every other SEC team, right? Vanderbilt's had a couple tough weekends. Kudos to Vanderbilt. Like they went out to LA and played a tournament. I think did they go to Phoenix opening weekend? But anyway, they've played a couple of tough weekends, whereas most SEC teams played just one. But for the most part, so I think you can say the same exact thing about every other SEC club in terms of, hey, the numbers look great, and hey, the talented guys look talented, but against who? I think that's something you could say about everybody. So I'm not going to over-index on trying to worry too much about that, because the same could be applied to everyone.
Yeah, 100%. As far as LSU and Tennessee, and we got into this just a little bit, but I mean, I think, especially with the way A&M has started, is it fair to say they are the co-favorites in the SEC race? And that's by the way, one thing Jay Johnson has not done yet at LSU is win an SEC regular season title. And so I don't want to eliminate other teams, because as you mentioned, as much as everybody talks about it in men's basketball, this happens every year in baseball, where there's like, what are there, 8 teams with either 0 or 1 loss in the SEC, 10 with 2 or fewer, and like 13 of the 16 have only 3 losses or fewer. So there's so many good teams. But is it fair to say, Joe, this is LSU, this is Tennessee, and they are the heavyweights at the top of this?
Yeah, I think so. To my eyes, no disrespect to Arkansas or Georgia that are also high up there in the rankings, it feels like 1 and 2 have kind of separated themselves right now. I think you could reasonably have either team number 1, and then of course the other number 2, and then there's kind of a gap until you get to Arkansas in my mind, at least right now. So I'm with you there. And on the bigger picture stuff, like you see it in our rankings. I think we have 12 SEC teams ranked, something like that. So just from a figuring out who's who and what's what standpoint, we need conference play to start, so these teams start beating up on each other a little bit and give us a little bit of perspective. Because to the larger point we've been talking about here the last few minutes, it's just like everyone has 1 or 2, not everyone, most have 1 or 2 losses, and it's like I don't know how to separate that. So hopefully, SEC play will give us a little bit of clarity starting this weekend.
And part of that's roster, and part of that's the roster you thought they were going to have and kind of coming into the season, and just how they looked in some of the, not just obviously they're all non-conference games, but the tougher non-conference games, and how are they dominating the teams that they should be beating, And I think Texas A&M was supposed to be the 3rd team sort of in this tier, but then they've lost 6 games now, including like 4 or 5 to much lesser opponents. So I think it's all sort of put into the same big pot, I guess, so to say.
Yeah,
right.
I think that's right. And it's important to, to acknowledge too, that we're still working, whether it's the rankings or how we talk about these teams, it's early enough. We're still using a lot of preseason expectation. And I think that's part of why we look at A&M so negatively. Now, they also have not been playing well. I'm not here to make the argument that they are, but if they were ranked 20 to start the year, and now they'd be out of the top 25 now, but we'd just be like, all right, well, they got some things to work out. Let's see what happens in SEC play. But the fact that we thought, oh man, this team is number 1 with a bullet. And it's, I said on radio, perhaps embarrassingly, like it's the one totally complete roster in college baseball. Therefore, they're the overwhelming number 1. And it's like, well, okay, 2 weeks into things, it took precisely 1 injury. And I'm not blaming all of this on Gavin Grahovic's injury, but it took precisely 1 injury and some guys coming out of the gate kind of slow for us to realize, like, oh, wait a minute, they're not nearly as infallible as we thought they were.
Where do you think, I guess, before we move on, like I'm kind of curious, where do you think Florida's in this hierarchy? Because LSU's not playing them this year, so we're not going to sort of talk about them later on the podcast. So I kind of, and they're also one of the, I guess, top teams, one of the few top teams that LSU's not playing. I guess them and Vanderbilt. I kind of want to get your thoughts on the Gators in particular, and maybe even Vandy.
Yeah, I think with Florida, I think they're in that mix with, I think LSU and Tennessee is a class of its own. I think Arkansas is kind of a class of its own after that. And then to me, Florida's there with like Georgia, right? Where the upside is national title type of upside, but there's also a floor that's maybe a little bit lower than those three teams that we have up at the top. And part of that now, this was not the case at the start of the year. Part of that now is just, I mean, considering we're 4 weeks into this thing, they are banged up. You know, Kyle Jones was transferred from Stetson, who in the outfield, who was awesome in the fall. Like I fell in love with his game, and he's out for the year after 4 games. He's been out since the first week of the season. Pierce Capola, who is a rotation guy, who's been injured basically his entire. He's a little bit of the Florida Chase Shores in terms of like, you know, we heard so many great things about him, and it's just taken forever to get him on the field. And he missed his start last weekend. And Cade Kurland injured his shoulder in the Miami series and hasn't come back yet. I presume he'll be back at some point, but not as of yet. So those are some pretty important pieces, and Florida has depth, especially on the mound. But when we're talking about splitting hairs with some of these really talented teams in the SEC, sometimes that kind of thing's a difference maker. So I like their team. I don't love their team, kind of like I did in the preseason. There's a lot of positive things, like Brody Donay is a more complete hitter. Like that's a huge thing for them. And like, it's a requirement at Florida. You have to throw 95 to get on the mound, apparently. So they like, stuff is just incredible. Vanderbilt's interesting to me, just quickly on them. So much of the question about them is offense related, and I'm not sold yet. I like Brody Johnston, the freshman. He looks like the real deal. RJ Austin's one of the most dynamic players in the country, but they're leaning on some guys right now, some other freshmen, a JUCO transfer, guys like that to really carry them. And it just kind of remains to be seen if that's sustainable for them. So we'll see. But I will say, I was also kind of lukewarm on their rotation, and now I feel pretty good about it. Cody Bowker, a Georgetown transfer, whose stuff, when I saw him in the summer, it felt like he was just okay. I was like, this looks like a midweek guy, but he's cleaned some things up. His stuff is playing up right now. He and JD Thompson have made a great 1-2. And then Ethan McIlvain on the Sun, they're kind of piggybacking him on Sunday, which I like. And his stuff is electric. So if that's the right role for him, I like what I see there. So I kind of feel like Vanderbilt is maybe like a slightly wealthier man's version of what they've been, which is to say they could host, they could challenge to get to Omaha, perhaps if they get a good draw, but I don't necessarily see them as being a true national title contender. It just doesn't quite stack up to the rosters at LSU, Tennessee, Arkansas, Florida, et cetera.
Yeah. And Georgia's taking that next step as well. And the fight in West Johnson's. I mean, it seems like they just have a lot more pitching depth, right? Just the sort of, even if they don't have quite as much star power at the plate, right? I'm not like making that up out of thin air, right?
No, I think that's right. Like they are really deep in both units. Georgia is, but the pitching staff still feels unsettled, and that's not negative to me. I mean, their ERA is, I think, second or third highest in the SEC right now, so they're still figuring some things out. But man, I saw them opening weekend, and I think it's more depth of stuff than I've ever seen on a college roster. Like,
really?
They like the 10th arm they used opening weekend. I don't know if that's literally the number, but it was like day 3 of the weekend, and they've used up most of the guys they're looking to use, and they bring in JT Quinn, who was a weekend guy at Ole Miss in like mop-up duty. And that dude's out there throwing 95 with a hammer curveball that like would be a rotation guy at, 300 other college baseball programs. Right. And so that just tells you kind of the depth they have. That like, look, JT Quinn was not a successful starter at Ole Miss, but the idea that they have someone with weekend starter quality as an extra piece in the bullpen kind of tells you where they're at from a depth standpoint. It just feels like for them, they've kind of been playing with their food a little bit, I would say, early this season in their games. It kind of feels like it's been they've had to work pretty hard for their wins. So I don't want to say skeptical, because I'm not skeptical of the talent, but I just kind of need to see them play better than what they've played, I guess, is the long and the short of it.
Interesting.
I just have to say a rich man's version of normal Vanderbilt, that's a different tax bracket than me. Not there.
Yeah. I said a slightly wealthier version. You know what I mean? Like they're putting more away in their Roth IRA than they normally,
which is a good thing nowadays.
That's right.
Oh, geez.
Joe, we won't go there any further. Joe, as far as storylines go, when you look at this SEC season, where is your focus? I mean, is this, like I said, this league is always very good. Is it better than usual? It seems like there may be more great teams that have national championship upside even than a normal SEC year.
Yeah, I think yes is the short answer there. And I think it's in large part because you bring in Texas who, okay, they kind of they changed coaches in the offseason because they weren't like classic Texas, but they were still pretty doggone good. You know, they'd been in Omaha, I think 3 times under David Pierce in 6 or whatever years he'd been there. Like it had not fallen off a cliff. But then like Oklahoma's really gotten a lot better the last several years. They came 1 win away from a national title, or 2 wins away. I guess they went 0-2 in the finals. But in 2022, they won the Big 12 last year. I've said it publicly on Highway to Hoover when they announced they were going to the SEC. I thought from a baseball standpoint, okay, Texas will be fine, but Oklahoma might be in for a rude awakening. And they've totally turned around that narrative in my mind. Now, they're not the class of the SEC or anything like that, but I kind of thought they'd have to really take a hard look at themselves and figure out what they need to do to compete. But they did it in getting ready for the SEC, and I think that's really impressive. And as a result, a couple of things I'm thinking kind of hard about. I think we'll get a preview of one of them with the men's basketball tournament here in a little bit, which is how does a committee deal with a league that big that has that many teams that are deserving? Because it's the eternal debate in all sports, that have a field built by humans, by a committee. It's deserving versus best, right? And the SEC might have 14 teams that are among the best, however many at-large bids they have to give. But are they all deserving? What's the cutoff on conference record? Can you go 11-19 in the SEC and get in? Those are questions we haven't really had to contend with, right? So there's that. And then on the other end of that is that, look, outside of Missouri, the other 15 teams came into the season thinking, all right, yeah, we're a regional team. No question. Well, I can guarantee you 15 teams aren't getting in. So there's going to be a couple teams that had really high hopes for this season that are going to be pretty disappointed when it's all said and done. And how do those programs either adapt or change or whatever to make sure that doesn't happen again, because somebody's going to be disappointed with the way this season goes.
I do find that interesting because you kind of have and the sports are obviously kind of brother and sister, but in softball, the SEC routinely puts every team in a regional. And it doesn't matter if you went, they play 27 games. If you went 4-23 in the SEC in softball, if you were good enough and your RPI or whatever they use says you're good enough, then you're in. Whereas in baseball, there's kind of been this artificial, I can't go worse than 13-17. And now it's sliding a little bit. Now it's maybe 12-18. And you mentioned 11-19. But at some point, and you mentioned basketball too, like Oklahoma, I think where did they go 5-13 in conference play? And people say, well, that doesn't even show up on the team sheet that the committee sees. They see this is how many quad 1 wins they had. This is their quad 2 record. It doesn't matter whether they were conference games or not conference games. We're comparing that against the team from Conference USA or whatever. So that is going to be fascinating. And I think also, the margin between some of these teams is going to be so small that even though you talk LSU and Tennessee are the class, if they slump for 3 weeks, they could easily go 3-6, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I've always said that's one of the more underrated things about how cutthroat the SEC is that it's been pretty hard coded in the SEC the last, since the field expanded to 64, that, to your point, Zach, like 13 wins gets you on the board. You may not get in, but it gets you on the board. And then starting at 15 wins, you start to get talked about as a host. So the difference between someone wanting to fire its coach and hosting a regional is like 3 wins. and so that's just crazy. That's bonkers. Right. And so that's life. Right. And to the larger point, I feel like the 3 of us could do an entire podcast around nothing but this. I don't know enough about softball to really be able to be super informed on this, but I've always been fascinated by the difference in philosophy there, because you're right that in theory, conference record is not a metric that they point to. Now, occasionally you do have something where they'll come out and say, I remember a few years ago, a 14-16 SEC team missed, and they were like, well, we didn't like they didn't finish over 500 in conference. And it just felt like a convenient excuse.
I think it was Missouri, Joe, actually, come to think of it.
Yeah, that you might be right, because they had a couple of years under Beazer there where it was like 13-17, 14-16, but their RPI was like, 48 or something like that, and something in that neighborhood. So anyway, moral of the story is just, I don't know why that philosophy is different. But it is. And honestly, I'm not saying I disagree with it from a baseball standpoint, because I don't love the idea of just because you happen to play a bunch of really tough games that just kind of automatically gets you into the field. I don't love that as someone who just loves college baseball. But I also understand the logic, I guess, if you think those teams are the best teams. But anyway, I digress.
That felt like Florida a little bit last year, where
they
were literally a 500 team. They got swept by Missouri. Granted, that was on the road, and I don't know. They definitely had some good wins, but it was like, is this team? They were basically the 11th. They felt like the 11th team of the 11 that ended up getting into the tournament. But heck, that team ended up getting to Omaha. So perhaps I was wrong anyway. So
well, that's the thing too, is that like that's the thing too. Like, for those of us who don't want to see the tournament become that, like, it's not great for the enterprise that Florida was one win away from not being able to be an at-large team, like, because they weren't over 500 until last day of the season, and they finished Final Four. And then a couple of years ago, Ole Miss won the national title as the last team in the field. So, like, for those of us that don't like the idea of like just existing in the SEC is enough to be in the NCAA tournament, that's not great, because it does send a message. And I think it's right. Like, I'm also not arguing with this. Like, those two teams were clearly some of the, two of the 64 best in their given years, and they proved it. But it just kind of highlights why this is so tricky and difficult and what have you.
Well, it's definitely going to be cutthroat. We know that, no matter what. Joe, let's dive in a little bit to LSU's schedule here, as we focus back on the Tigers. And again, they start with Missouri. It's an SEC game in name only. I think one thing it is, and Koki, this is probably something the team is talking about too, is like, it's a chance to get off to a good start. And you at least at home, you at least need to win that series. You'd probably like to sweep it and get out to a 3-0 start, which a lot of other teams are not going to do. So it starts there, but in general, the first half of the schedule seems manageable, even though 3 of these series are on the road.
I think that's right. And getting Missouri at home is also a big deal, because there's something about, Zach, I'm sure you know this, there's something about Taylor Stadium in Columbia, Missouri, where teams just go there and then just like forget how to play baseball.
I the whole season there, man. I got stories for you.
Yeah, it's just like, 2 years ago, Tennessee gets swept. Last year, Florida gets swept. Kentucky 2 years ago either lost a series or was darn near close. Like, and everyone I talk to is like, man, that trip is so difficult, and no one can really tell you why. Now, some of it is it's usually colder. The stadium's on top of a hill. It's super windy. Obviously, it's not as palatial, as that's putting it kindly, as other SEC venues. So like, it's a little more uncomfortable to play there for road teams than it is at some of these other venues. But regardless, getting that at home, I think is huge, because while Missouri's has shown to not be a very good team so far this season, like, they also have scholarships too. So like, you just never know. But so I'm with you. The front half of the schedule, I think, is manageable. Getting Mississippi State at home is a big deal, I think, because that's obviously a pretty talented team. And then, you look at Texas and Oklahoma and Auburn and Alabama, and those are all teams that are good, but is there a national title contender in that group? I don't know. Ultimately, probably. Just, I think the numbers in the SEC suggest that one of those teams will work its way into that conversation, but at least on paper right now, maybe not. And so I agree that the front half at least should put the team in a situation to get off to a strong start.
Palatial, that's a heck of a word. I don't think we've had that
thank you.
podcast yet. Yeah. I think I agree with you, Joe. I will say though, it is interesting that they put them in, that they sent them to Texas and Oklahoma in the first season that both teams are in the league. I'd like to know kind of what the thinking is behind that. And I think we should probably mention that Auburn has been probably a little better than what we expected heading into the season for sure.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah, they have been. They still have questions to answer on the mound. They had a game last weekend against Old Dominion where they had a 9-2 lead and lost. So like they've still got some things to work out. But yeah, the offense has been, they're a little like LSU in this regard. LSU obviously quite a bit better, but they have like this handful of young players that we were kind of like, well, they're good, but are they going to be ready? And they just are. Or at least it seems that way. So they're a little bit similar in that regard. But yeah, they've exceeded my expectations already, I would say.
We got 3 revenge series. And there's a lot of revenge series this year with the big finale against South Carolina on the final weekend of the year. But we've got 3 in the first half. We got Aiden Moffitt at Texas. That's the first revenge series. We've got Cam Johnson, who's assuming he stays healthy and pitches decently. He would pitch that Sunday game in the Oklahoma series, and we have Sam Dutton, who'd pitch probably Friday or Saturday in the Auburn series. So all former Tigers, all on the schedule. Road series for now, but I mean, eventually, like Brady Neal's going to be coming to Baton Rouge. So a lot of revenge series this year. That we haven't had a lot of that the last couple of years, but this year's that's all over the schedule.
And it just goes to show the quality of the roster that Jay Johnson and the staff have built. That Cam Johnson's a rotation guy for Oklahoma, and Sam Dutton's so far has been the best pitcher on Auburn staff. Yeah. Right. And so, those are 2 examples of, and I don't know if he'll hold the job, but Brady Neal was the starter at catcher right away at Alabama. So it just kind of goes to show that, I don't want to say spare parts, because that seems rude, but guys that LSU could live without end up going into prominent roles right away at some other pretty good programs.
Yeah. Always a great sign of that depth. And, yeah, it is interesting, Koki, your point of going to Texas and Oklahoma. I don't know this for sure, but it would make sense if the SEC said, you know what, let's give them a visit from a flagship program in their first year and say this is SEC baseball. And if the SEC has a flagship program, if you had to just pick one, it would probably be LSU. So that makes sense. I don't know if that was the plan or it just happened that way, but it's in the first 4 weeks of the season. So the plan.
Quickly, I think LSU is the favorite in every series. Do you think I'm right, Joe, on that?
Yeah, I think you'd be. Yeah, that's fair. Mm-hmm.
And which one would you say would be the toughest? My lean is Texas, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
I think I'm with you, because it's the combination of, I think Oklahoma is a tricky team. I think specifically for this LSU team, because the way Oklahoma plays offensively, they're going to try to get on base and then just run all over you. And make things happen. And so I think that is tricky. But I think Texas is the tougher trip, at least on paper for me, because you're also going to get the combination of that's a stadium that seats, 10,000 or whatever it is. It's a big venue with big crowds and loud. And Texas is also, it's that classic Jim Schlossnagle thing that they did when he was at A&M immediately, which is that the offense is just going to bite and claw and scratch to get every last thing. They're going to run up pitch counts. There's going to be about 1 million pitching changes because their pitching is not as good as it will eventually be, or they want it to be. So the game's going to grind to a halt, and it's just going to be this battle of attrition. And those games are really hard to win on the road. It's just a matter. That's just the reality of it. Even if you're more talented, trying to go on the road and win those types of games is really hard.
Just to put in perspective here, and again, should have mentioned this at the top. LSU's 16-1, excuse me, but we're recording this Tuesday. They play Xavier on Tuesday night, so we don't have the result of that game yet. But we're talking about the softer half of the schedule that includes games, at 13-1 Texas, at 14-1 Oklahoma, at 13-3 Auburn. I mean, softer is certainly a relative term.
That's life. That's that's the thing is it is technically so I looked this up because I want to make sure I had the right information. My colleague at SEC Extra, Mark Etheridge, is a big data guy, and he looked at relative strength of schedule, and LSU has ranked from number 1 being most difficult to number 16 being least difficult, number 12. So they're on the least difficult end of the spectrum. And as I presume we're about to talk about the second half of the schedule, it goes to show how tough the rest of the league has it, that we're about to talk about is the 12th toughest schedule in the SEC.
Yeah. I mean, Joe, do those numbers include non-conference performance that's current as of today?
No, it was preseason based on prior year. I think he did 3 or 4 years worth of data into that. So prior SEC conference performance for the handful of years prior.
Okay, so that's the first half. The second half, I guess the good news is you get 3 of the 5 series at home. The bad news is, that we talked about that at the beginning of the season, Koki, that 3-week stretch, and obviously Texas A&M hasn't gotten off to the start we thought. But a lot of times, I don't know, you see this in a lot of sports where these teams that were ranked high in the preseason and get off to bad starts, they usually figure it out, at least somewhat, by the end of the year. I mean, that's still a very talented team in College Station. And then you sandwich that trip around home series with Tennessee and Arkansas. And then, of course, ending the year with the Paul Mainieri revenge series at South Carolina. So just a super intriguing, difficult, and I think really fun second half of the SEC. Fun for me, maybe not for Jay.
Right. Yeah. It could be a little more stressful in the dugout than it will be for us sitting in press boxes or at home or what have you. First things first, I kind of wish that South Carolina series was in Baton Rouge because I'd love for Paul to get I'm sure that'll happen in 2026, but I would just love for Paul to get a moment at Alec Box Stadium because I understand. I'm not even saying it was, but I understand like why there was some consternation about the end of his tenure there and why there were some folks that were ready to move on. But I also think we're in a place now, especially now that LSU has won another national title, where I do think the faithful would be able to have a moment where they appreciate Paul and kind of give him a thank you for all that he did for the program and getting him where they are. So I assume that will come in 2026, but I'm just eager for that to happen because I think enough time has passed and enough good things have happened for LSU and for Paul now being back in the game that I think they can kind of have that moment together. And I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, those 3 series though, I mean, Tennessee, A&M, Arkansas, I mean, I'm with you. Texas A&M will be fine. And we may have to redefine what fine means, right? They're no longer a runaway best roster in baseball, best, this and that and the other, but they're certainly still in the conversation among the most talented rosters in college baseball. They're right there with Tennessee, Arkansas, LSU in terms of upside. And just certain, those are going to be when you talk about SEC baseball, just being different. Those series are what we're talking about, where the quality of play on the field is going to be like, I don't know, high A, double A, probably more like double A. And that's not what college baseball looked like 15 years ago, right? Like there are going to be guys all over the field in that series against Tennessee, A&M, and Arkansas that are guys that just 15 years ago, because college baseball wasn't as big a deal, NIL wasn't a thing, college baseball wasn't as prominent, they'd be off in pro ball. But now we get to enjoy that in college baseball. So yes, everybody, we're out there to, those teams are out there to win games and all that jazz. But also I think just as college baseball consumers, those series give us a chance to step back and say like, holy cow, like college baseball is just in such a different place than it was not that long ago. And these teams are kind of the embodiment of that.
I would completely agree with everything you said. And I think kind of the crescendo of that was 2023, where you had like Paul Skeens and a major leaguer going up against Brett Lauder, a soon to be major leaguer with, Chase Burns was on Tennessee, he's now a soon to be major leaguer. Dylan Cruz, major leaguer, Wyatt Langford, major leaguguer, like all in the same college World Series, on like multiple different teams. And it was like, it was just absolutely absurd. But I think what's good for LSU when it even comes to the second half of this season with the SEC play is that Tennessee and Arkansas are at home this year. That's big. Last year they got those series on the road. It was really tough and that, incredibly difficult first half of the schedule that they had last year. Now those teams are in the second half and are at home, which I think is something that Jay Johnson likes to see. And obviously, you don't want to face Texas A&M, especially on the road. And I guess A&M will have more time to figure themselves out by the time they play that series. So it makes it even tougher to be like, what are they going to look like by then? But again, like they have Jace Laviolette, who's going to be a top 5 pick. They got, all these other really, really good players. Ryan Prager should be in Major League Baseball right now, but he isn't. They got a bunch of dudes. So the South Carolina series is going to be really, really emotional. Probably more on South Carolina's part because Paul Mainieri and just the emotions that he's going to be going up against by facing his former team, and LSU's going on the road, so it makes it a little bit of a different dynamic there. But that's still going to be really, really fun regardless of the turnout. So I'd say the second half is probably more fun than the first half. Like that Tennessee series, they're probably gonna break the freaking attendance record for that game as well, because last time they faced Tennessee, they broke the attendance record on that Friday game. So it's a very exciting second half of the year, even though it's definitely more difficult for LSU.
The one team we really haven't talked about in this group very much is Alabama, and they might have the best player in college baseball with Justin LeBron.
Yeah.
Who they do call Bronny. That's his nickname in the program there. But I mean, he's playing like the LeBron of college baseball right now. That's for sure. Like when he came in as a freshman last year, it was like, all right, this guy from day one is going to be ready defensively. He's a premium athlete. He can really pick it, strong arm, all that stuff. But it's like, he's pretty thin and he's not the biggest guy. Like, is he going to be able to hit in the SEC? And the answer is yes. And now, I mean, look, he hasn't seen an SEC pitch yet this season, but the dude has 11 home runs and he's driven in more than 40 runs already. And I saw him in Jacksonville a few weeks ago, and it's not just like, hey, he can turn on a fastball in the inner half and get it out, tuck it around the foul pole kind of thing. Like, he's going in a minor league park, so a little bit bigger than your typical college park. He's going like opposite gap to hit balls out 400 something. Like, it's real bat speed. And so Alabama's got questions on the mound. Like, will the lineup depth be able to support him? We don't know. But that weekend, LSU will have to pitch to and deal with arguably the best player in college baseball with Justin LeBron.
Yeah. So just add to the fun of that second half of the season.
Yeah.
I love that kid's name, by the way. And I think he's a 2026 draft kid, correct? Like,
correct. Yeah.
He's going to be, well, presumably in Tuscaloosa this day and age. You never know about transfers, but presumably he'll be in the SEC for 2 more years.
Yeah.
By the way, per your point about watching future major leaguers go against each other, I'm dating myself here, but I covered a Missouri-Nebraska series when I was in college, in which Max Scherzer faced Alex Gordon and Joba Chamberlain was Nebraska's starter. And I used to tell that story as, wow, that's such a rare thing in college baseball. It's every weekend anymore. It seems like. So lots of fun. Before we let you go, Joe, I don't want to put you in the spot and pick a winner. It's almost impossible at this point. But maybe circle something we haven't talked about this SEC baseball season that you're looking forward to, or you think is the key, or anything of that ilk.
I think so. I've been thinking about this actually a decent bit, and we've had this trend the last several years in the SEC where, and maybe it ends up being A&M this year, where some team that we have really high hopes for just gets stuck in a hole, right? Like LSU last year at whatever 3-12 or whatever it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, Tennessee the year before, they were 5-10 in SEC play. Like, it's been like several years in a row where we've had some team that ends up in Omaha. You can throw Florida in that bucket from last year. Like, the teams that avoid that stuff, like, are going to be at such an advantage, because by the time the season ended last year, LSU was playing like a top 5 team. It just so happened, because they took so long to get going, they ended up having to play on the road against another top 5 team in North Carolina. And they just got beat in one of the best regional finals that I've ever seen. Yeah. Like I have no dog in the fight. And like, I was nervous watching that regional final game, because it was just so tense. And you just knew that like it was going to come down to like one play basically. And anyway, so who can avoid those pitfalls? Who can get off to us? And I think LSU's schedule, to what we've talked about, like, is helpful in that regard to get them off to a better start, because, playing at home, especially at SEC venues, is just such a cheat code, because teams, even some good 2 seeds from leagues like the ACC or Big 12 just don't play in venues like that week after week. In those leagues, there are some, but not every week like the SEC, where 14 or 15 out of the 16 have electric atmospheres every weekend. So that's something to watch. The other thing, and this is not specific to to LSU or anything else, is like, I have my eye on the Mississippi schools again, because it's been this like roller coaster ride the last few years, and Chris Lemonis doesn't seem to have bought himself a whole lot of goodwill with getting back to a regional last year. If they struggle this year, like, that goodwill is going to expire pretty quickly. And then with Ole Miss, can they get back, into a postseason position, or do they have to start having an uncomfortable conversation about a program legend in Mike Bianco? So those 2 programs are always fascinating, and this is no different this year.
Yeah, it's weird that Ole Miss isn't on the LSU schedule this year.
Yeah, that is weird to see. Yeah,
which is very odd. But they're playing Mississippi State third weekend of the SEC slate, so that's going to be. We didn't really talk about that series much, but that'll be an interesting series. Always is with those guys. I mean, 2 years ago in 2023, when they didn't even make the SEC tournament, let alone the NCAA tournament, they came into Baton Rouge, fell down 9-2 in Game 3 of the rubber match, and came back and won the game.
Yeah.
So there's always something odd going on. Last year, it felt like they knew what pitch was coming because they were hitting the ball so well. So we'll see what the rematch looks like this year in Baton Rouge.
Well, Joe, we appreciate you being so generous with your time, man. And as we begin SEC play on Friday, I'm going to give you a little plug here. That starts the legitimate highway to Hoover. So tell people where they can find you and your work and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, good segue there. Well done. Highway to Hoover.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah.
He really is.
Highway to Hoover, wherever you get your podcasts. We're happy to have you join myself and Mark Etheridge. We go twice a week. Recap podcast every Monday. Then I have a beat writer on every week. Koki was my guest last week. So if you're an LSU fan listening to this and you did not see that at the time, go back and listen to that. A lot of good information on that episode. And then, D1Baseball.com for all of our written work. If you haven't taken the plunge yet, if you've been on the fence, now is kind of the time to do it if you're an SEC fan, because we've got a 10-week sprint basically to Hoover, and it's going to be a heck of a lot of fun. So come and join us.
All right. He's Joe Healy of D1Baseball.com, our guest to preview the SEC baseball season. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
We will be right back after this with TJ Brown to talk some men's basketball.
There's no better place to parlay than Caesars Sportsbook. With quick picks, you can tap right into pre-built, ready-to-bet parlays right from the home screen. And if you miss tip-off, no worries. You can play same-game parlays live during the action. Plus, it's never been easier to find and bet on the biggest matchups of the day, so you can keep up with all the action. Caesars Sportsbook, proud partner of the NBA and the only sportsbook app with Caesars Rewards. Download it today.
All right, welcome back to the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the like button while you're down there. Transitioning from the beginning of a great SEC baseball season to the end of a great SEC men's basketball season. He is Toyloy Brown, our men's basketball beat writer for LSU for The Advocate. And unfortunately, it's been a great season for just about every team in the league except for the Tigers, TJ.
Yeah. What's up? Nice to see you, Zach. I wish it was on happier terms if there was some more success or some more positive, but LSU currently is on a 5-game losing streak going into the SEC tournament against a team they played on March 1st, where they lost by, I think, 13 or 14. And I can't say they've gotten better since then.
Yeah, it looked for, I don't know, a week there, like LSU had turned a corner a little bit. I mean, they had a lead late into a game in Fayetteville, and Arkansas was playing very well. Then they turned around and won in Norman, beat South Carolina, who was also playing better, beat them by 14 points at home, and then really took, Florida, even though it ended up being a 14-point game, they took number 2 Florida down to the last 5-6 minutes of that game at home also. But they lost the momentum in that game. They lose to Tennessee in another close game, but then since then it's just kind of not been competitive against Mississippi State and Kentucky and Texas A&M to end the season. So they play Mississippi State again. It's at 6:00 tonight as you're listening to this. Again, we're recording Tuesday, but the game is Wednesday night at 6 p.m. in Nashville. What do you think of this matchup for LSU? Is this, obviously you like to dream in college basketball at this time of year in March. Is there a place to dream here for LSU? I mean, what kind of path do they have for that?
Yeah, so Mississippi State is a team led by a point guard that's 5'10" on a good day named Josh Hubbard. That's their best player, and everyone else is mainly a defensive-oriented player. Maybe a shooter, but not really too much offense to speak of outside of that point guard I mentioned. That point guard had 30 points against LSU, and I think had at least 22 or 20 in the second half, and was just purely dominant. So any chance of LSU having an upset over Mississippi State, it starts with him. He was, I think, out of all the teams they played in the SEC, Janai Broome of Auburn, Alabama's guards, Mark Sears, and their big men, Morey and all of them. Josh Hubbard had the best star showing against LSU of any opposing team. So Yeah, he's very capable of just ending the game like he did against them on March 1st. And any chance of the LSU Tigers winning starts with that. After that, LSU has to do two things. One, they have to find their secondary score, the pair up with Cam Carter, who just came off his worst game of the season, 7 points on 2 of 12 shooting against A&M, which was really unfortunate on senior day. Secondly, they also need to rebound. Rebounding has been a key central issue for them this entire season. It gets harder when you don't have Corey Chest, which is a possibility. He's been out the last, I believe, 3 games with a foot issue. And they also maybe without a 6'5" guard who's not a great rebounder, but at 6'5", he helps out on the glass and is a scorer. And Victorious Miller, who's hurt with an ankle injury. Both those guys haven't practiced. They might have practiced today potentially or yesterday. But when I last spoke to McMahon, they had not practiced by Saturday, and they were off on Sunday. So without those 2 players, and if they don't have a secondary score, it's going to be really tough. I guess the other possibility is if they can just somehow shut the water off on that Josh Hubbard player. I don't see it happening, but let's say Josh Hubbard is 18 points on 32% field goal percentage, a really bad field goal percentage, and get some turnovers. Maybe that's a way that they can hopefully keep Mississippi State from having a big lead or getting up double digits. But yeah, it's really difficult. As you can tell from my voice and just the sort of pathways, it's not all that likely, but it's possible. Maybe I'll say this last thing that McMahon said, or one of the last things that he said was that of course, disappointing end, 5-game losing streak. They lost really badly to Kentucky on the road. They lost in front of their home fans to end the season on senior day, which is not a good taste in anyone's mouth. But it's a reset. Everyone's 0-0 in the SEC tournament. And Mississippi State, they're really good. They played them. Unfortunately, they have played them recently, so they have sort of intimate knowledge of just, okay, this is what we did poorly. Let's try to tweak these certain things and try to get over the top on them.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy. I will say, and we talk about dreaming. One of the side effects of these bigger and bigger conferences, you have all 16 SEC teams in Nashville. It's harder for a lower seed to make a run. I mean, LSU would have to win 5 games in 5 days to make the NCAA tournament. It's like you almost have to laugh as you mentioned it. It's just not. And they got, I think they got a pretty kind draw as things worked out.
They did.
You got a Mississippi State team that in their own right has not been playing well. That win at home against LSU is their only win in their last 5 regular season games. They lost to Oklahoma, they lost to Texas, they lost to Arkansas. These are not great teams. They also got just demolished by Alabama, the one really good team in that stretch. And then if LSU should upset the Bulldogs on Wednesday, their opponent on Thursday would be the 7 seed Missouri, which has lost 3 in a row to end the regular season as well. So, these are good teams. You're facing teams that aren't real hot, but at the same time, you're facing a Mississippi State team that's been in the top 25 most of the year. They dropped out. Then you're facing a Mizzou team that is in the top 25. And then if you should happen by some stroke of luck or genius or both to win both of those games, your reward on Friday would be to face number 4 Florida in the quarterfinals. So it's like, this is just not there. You talk about light at the end of the tunnel. There's none. Like, we can't see the other side of the tunnel.
Yeah, it's hellish. It's horrible in terms of just you have to reach such a high bar in order to win. And unfortunately for LSU, they have a very small margin of error, extremely small. That margin of error includes we don't turn the ball over, which has been a positive. They had a little bit more turnovers in their last game, but they went from a team averaging 13, 14. They had, I think, 20 turnovers against Auburn to now only having single digits in the last 5 or 6 games, which is tremendous for their development. But they have to not turn it over, crash the glass, and not get destroyed on the boards by more than 10 or 12. They have to make at least 35% of the threes, make at least 7 or 8, which is not always a guarantee. Have Cam Carter play well. Have Jordan Sears or a secondary scorer play well. Sears came off his best game in a long time. He had 21 against A&M. Came back from an ankle injury during the game, twisted it really bad, but came back 2 minutes later. And they have to hope that they can shut down the best player on the opposing team or limit them to below their average. Those are 6 different things that have to sort of hit and be nailed in order for LSU to get a win. And it's really hard to live like that. And it's not sort of, I trust me, I wish I was exaggerating, but they sort of have to nail on like 5 to 6 of those things in order to get a win, even against a team that's not as hot in Mississippi State. And it's possible. It's just that was the case in the last 5 games that they lost as well.
Right. And then to do it again the next night and again the next night against better and better teams, it just becomes a very difficult thing. It's like it's the inverse of you say great teams can win games when they're not playing well. It's LSU has to play great to even have a chance against some of these teams, it feels like. And so that's what's difficult. TJ, we talked about this briefly a couple of weeks ago on the pod. There is still a possibility that LSU could make the NIT. The rules changed on the NIT, and the top 2 teams from the SEC, and I think it's the ACC is the other conference, that don't make the NCAA tournament are automatically in. So even though LSU went 3-15 in SEC play, it was not a good season by any stretch of the imagination. But if the SEC gets 13 teams in, which Oklahoma's gotten hot, it looks like they may be the 13th team to get in, then Texas and LSU would be the 2 teams chosen automatically for the NIT.
Yeah. I think I saw some bracketology for the NIT recently, and I had LSU, I think, like a 4th seed in that bracketology.
That'd be a home game. I mean, not just the NIT; they'd be at home.
Yeah, that'd be crazy. So there's likely to be more basketball, even if LSU loses on Wednesday. The NIT won't be smooth sailing either. They lost last year to North Texas in the NIT the first round, so those games aren't easy wins. Also, I'm excited to cover as much basketball as possible. It's just that LSU needs to. They have such a minimal. It's sort of, and also I didn't mention this, foul trouble. Their big men, Damian Collins and Robert Miller, they played together, or each of them played less than 15 minutes in their last home game, and that was all because of foul trouble. So that's another sort of hurdle they have to overcome in order to even give themselves a chance to have an upset victory. The NIT, those things will also persist unless somehow things magically, I guess, improve in terms of players making more shots or things just not happening in a negative fashion.
I think they'd just be glad to play a non-SEC team at some point.
Yeah.
Because the season still had a lot of promise at the new year when we turned to SEC play. So we'll wrap it up this week. But before we sign off, TJ, let's do some predictions. This conference has been so much fun. At least if you're not an LSU fan, or I guess a South Carolina fan, like it's just been every week has had huge games. You've got Alabama will play Tennessee, or Auburn will play Florida, or Texas A&M plays one of those great teams, Missouri or something, like Kentucky. All of these weeks have had big games, and we're going to get a bunch of them in Nashville this week. So who is in the best position in your eyes to survive the chaos? Auburn's the number 1 seed. They're the regular season champs. And I guess they're the default favorite. Is that who you're going with, or do you like somebody else?
So I think Auburn has out of the top teams, the upper echelon of the SEC. I think they have the best chance to easily get to the finals. If they win their quarterfinals, they play Tennessee most likely. If Tennessee gets out of their quarterfinals, I think Auburn's just better than Tennessee in the semifinals match, and they'll be in the championship. Outside of Auburn, though, I do like Florida a great deal. If things are chalk, Florida would play Alabama in that semifinals match, and I like Florida to beat them that last time they played. Which was a really fun game. And Alex Condon was a monster in that game. I think I like Alabama's talent a lot, and they just beat Auburn on the road, so that was a huge win. It's like a game winner. I'm always a little leery of game-winning sort of victories. Awesome, but they're also sort of like it could have gone either way. I think if I wasn't choosing Auburn, who I think is going to win it, I think it's just their year. I would go with Florida for the SEC championship.
Yeah, Auburn did win it last year, the SEC tournament, and Alabama won it in both 2021 and 2023. I'll throw a bone to Tennessee. I think they've got a chance just because of the style they play, TJ, where you don't necessarily have to shoot it really well to win the game. And you can also, in a situation where even the top teams have to play 3 games in 3 days, something they don't do at any other time all year, maybe Thanksgiving week. But you've got a team that takes your legs out as far as jump shooting. And if they could survive, Texas A&M and then Auburn, by the time you get to Sunday, a team like Alabama might just be dog tired facing Tennessee. So I'll throw them out there as kind of a dark horse.
Yeah, and then in the last Auburn game against Alabama, Chad Baker-Mazzaro, their third best player, he got kicked out or rejected early from that game. So who knows if a situation like that appears when they play against Tennessee, most likely in that quarterfinals, semifinals matchup. So yeah, no, I don't mind the Tennessee pick at all. I have roots to Knoxville as a high school reporter in that area, so yeah, I have a lot of people pretty happy about that.
Yeah, fantastic. So before you head up to Nashville, we appreciate you joining us, TJ, and we are at some point in the next week or two do a postmortem on LSU basketball. We'll see. Again,
Yeah.
looks likely they'll make the NIT. If the SEC gets 13 bids to the NCAA tournament, then LSU would be one of the two teams automatically in the NIT. So look forward to that, and we'll do a wrap up on the season and what it means going forward for the future of LSU basketball and Matt McMahon after that. So,
yep, there'll be lots to say. There'll be lots to say in that conversation.
Yep, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. So we're looking forward to that. Appreciate TJ stopping by. Also, our baseball beat writer, Koki Riley, and special thanks to Joe Healy of D1Baseball for helping us preview the SEC baseball season on this episode of the LSU Sports Insider. Again, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Got a spring football preview up on there. Some live reaction videos. You never know. We might pop on a post-game show. If LSU basketball starts to go on a run, TJ, you're joining me from Nashville, man. We're gonna
yeah. I'll have my laptop ready. I'll have the Zoom or whatever we call it ready.
Yeah, fantastic. And so that will be coming up on this podcast feed. And until then, we thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the LSU Sports Insider.